This is only a longish tale by Stan Liebowitz, Michael Ward, and Alejandro Zentner. I'm Mike Ward. We're going to be re-examining long tail effects. That is, with improved product selection online and new product reviews and product recommendation systems, search capabilities, all these things should shift these purchases into more obscure titles. And we're going to do this by looking at the Nielsen BookScan data over a period of time when the buying books online has gone from sort of a rare event to a ubiquitous event. We're going to look at the actual data on lots of different titles. Two things we're going to do is we're going to look at the CDF and how it's changed over time. And one of the things we have to deal with was how do you define the head in terms of relative share or absolute share. And either way you slice this is a small, tiny effect or not any effect at all. The other thing we're going to do is look at this natural experiment of the Bookstores bankruptcy that happened in 2011 in the middle of our sample. And we're going to do a different for the cities that were losing lots of market share from Borders and those that did not. And in both of these, we show that there's not much of a shift from the head to the tail. If anything, there's a shift from the head to almost head. So it's longish. This is not new. Chris Anderson posed this idea, named this thing the long tail, and it's been a massively popular book and getting a lot of citations. Like I said before, this is a result of two different things. One is that online vendors can house a lot larger selection than brick and mortar stores can. The other is that these online stores have developed these search tools and product recommendation systems that have been shown to make it easier to find obscure products. There's another thing that is kind of at work here we're going to have to look at is that producing things online has made it so that there's lower fixed cost to producing these products, and that lowers the minimum efficient scale of a book, and so we observe a lot more entry of titles over our time horizon. A literature has developed that investigates the long tail, and most of this finds that the product selections have become less concentrated in the head over the time that this online shopping has become more ubiquitous. A few of them have different results though. But what really kicked this off is this influential paper in 2003. It's very highly cited and very influential, and it's described as saying that up to 20 to 40% of all books are going to fall outside of the top 100,000 products. Now they're going to base this on sales volume that is imputed from sales rank, assuming this power law, this linear relationship between log sales and log rank. This assumption is used often. Stan and Alejandro have another paper that shows that this is not linear and highly concave. And when you use this assumption, you can very easily, vastly overpredict the tail. We're going to overcome this by looking at sales volume directly. Again, we're going to do two different things. We're going to look at how the CDF has changed over this time period. And we're going to look at how the Borders bankruptcy affected the CDF of sales. Now, about these data, we have data on adult fiction and juvenile titles over this time period. In total, there's about 1.4 million titles, and we know the author, the publisher, units sold. These are annual data, and we have it for 99 different DMAs. This is Nielsen's definition that roughly correspond to metropolitan markets. The most popular books are the ones you probably recognize, you may have read. The one thing about this is that these data are very skewed. The 8,000 titles are going to sell over 100,000 units. Those are blockbusters. But there's also 1 million titles that sell fewer than 100 units over all time periods. There are a couple issues with the BookScan data. One is that there are some missing observations. The data are truncated at the top 250,000 titles per year. This is not a binding constraint until 2011, but by 2016 we have missing titles with 3 or fewer units sold, and we're going to have to impute these based on some growth trends in the previous years. And even if you're generous in constructing these synthetic observations, you get a trivial amount of increased sales or missing sales. The other is that there's a missing ebook segment. This wasn't important before 2010, but by 2017 it represented about a fifth of all books being sold. Now, the one thing we can look at is that the popularity of ebooks seems to mirror the popularity of print books. Now, the book market did change dramatically over this time period, and that's why we're studying it. That is, that very few people made purchases in 2000, and by 2016, lots of people were making purchases online. And in the book market, the sales at the beginning of our time period were about 4% of them were online, and by the end of our sample, it was about 40%. They had kind of plateaued by 2013. But the other big change is that there's a doubling in the number of titles from 250,000 to over 500,000 titles available each year. For example, if you look at the sales concentration defined in the percent of observations, that is the percent of titles. Well, one thing is you get to 5%, you've already gotten to close to 80-90% of all units sold. And once you get to 20% of titles, you're getting closer to 98% of all units sold. And so these are very concentrated markets. The other thing you get is that this CDF of this has shifted towards greater concentration when you do this in terms of these relative shares of titles. But if you look at these sales concentration in terms of absolute share of titles on time, so the horizontal axis now is the top 20,000 titles, top 40,000, 60,000, you get the same sort of pattern, but you actually get a downward shift in the CDF over this time horizon. And this is the tabular version of what we just saw. And you can look at the numbers. There's a little bit of variation from year to year, but they don't move that much. The biggest movement is in the top, in the far right column and the second to the right column, where there's some change, but it's really not that much. It goes from about 2% to 4.5% for the 60,000th highest title or higher. You can describe these bins as books that might be superstars, stars, books that would be still found in ordinary bookstores, in superstores, and then anything above 60,000 in sales rank is probably a pretty obscure title. And the only action we get really is in the obscure titles that go from 2% of the total to 4.5% of the total of products being sold. So we can take a look at what happened at Borders Bookstores. Now, this is a very successful company for about 4 decades, and they kind of inaugurated the large superstore format with comfy couches and all kinds of things going on that make it comfortable, that we now associate with Barnes & Noble. But they lost out to Barnes & Noble and Amazon, and in 2011 they filed for bankruptcy. Now, they had started closing a couple stores, a few stores before 2011, but they closed the rest of them in 2011. They could not find somebody to purchase these things. Now, their stores were in most of the Nielsen DMAs, and they had a market share in these DMAs between 1% and 68% in some markets. We're going to exploit this as a natural experiment. And this Borders bankruptcy shows up within the county business patterns data on the number of bookstores. And here we've defined them as number of bookstores with 20 or more employees. We think that might describe a superstore. And you can see that the green line where Borders had operated, they fell dramatically between 2010 and 2012. And that in the areas where the Borders did not operate, they did not fall nearly as much. Now, the other thing to point out here is that the Borders is more likely to be in bigger markets where there were more stores. So it's not a complete comparison. And there is some summary data on the sales in physical bookstores, and they really took a dive during the time of the Borders bankruptcy. And we think that some of those lost sales in the physical bookstores went to online bookstores. So we're going to run a series of diff and diffs for the 2 years, 2010 and 2012, for the different cities, 94 that we can get the data for. And we're going to look at these share bins that define the CDF. Going to have a fixed effect for each city and a dummy for 2012 versus 2010. And so it's two-way fixed effects. We're going to think of the dosage level in our treatment as the Borders market share. That's what fraction of the physical bookstores that were removed from that market. And we're going to define market share two different ways based on the number of employees that Borders represented in the book market and the number of superstore equivalents that Borders represented. We're going to have to, not all stores are the same size. We have to normalize these things. By the way, this analysis is going to work if we do it with a dummy variable as well. So these are our results for the different bins. Each coefficient is from a different regression. So we have two different measures of market share in the two different rows. And in the first column, that minus 3.810 means that if Borders market share went from 100% to 0%, then the share of books sold in the top 350 would fall by about 4%. Now, the top category does fall, and that means the other ones have to rise on net, and they do rise. But the two things about this is these coefficients are awfully small, and that the rise in the coefficients is really towards other book categories in the head and not really to the tail. So in sum, we have two different analyses. The time trends show that the CDFs barely budged at all. And over the 3-day period horizon of the Borders closing, the CDF did budge, but it really budged within the head and not to the tail. So we don't see this as much support for a large shift to niche products. Okay, thank you for your time. And you can find our paper in SSRN by Googling only a longish tail.